All right, well, let's go ahead and read at least a little bit. We might not read through the whole chapter just yet. But 2 Samuel 17, verse 1, it says, Moreover, Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night. And I will come upon him while he was weary and weak-handed, and he will make him afraid, and all the people that are with him shall flee. And I will smite the king only. And I will bring back all the people unto thee, the men whom thou seekest, as if all returned, so all the people shall be in peace. And the saying pleased Absalom well, and all the elders of Israel. And then said Absalom, Call now Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear likewise what he saith. And when Hushai was come to Absalom, Absalom spake unto him, saying, Ahithophel hath spoken after this manner. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou. And Hushai said unto Absalom, The counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time. For, said Hushai, thou knowest thy father and his men, that they be mighty men, and they be chafed in their minds, as a bear robbed of her whelps in the field. And thy father is a man of war, and will not lodge with the people. Behold, he is hid now in some pit or in some other place. And it will come to pass, when some of them be overthrown at the first, that whosoever heareth it will say, There is a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. And he also that is valiant, whose heart is as the heart of a lion, shall utterly melt. For all Israel knoweth that thy father is a mighty man, and they which be with him are valiant men. Therefore I counsel that all Israel be generally gathered unto thee, from Dan even unto Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that thou go to battle in thine own person. So shall we come upon him in some place where he shall be found, and we will light upon him as the dew falleth on the ground, and of him all the men that are with him, there shall not be left so much as one. Moreover, if he be gotten into a city, then shall all Israel bring ropes to that city, and we will draw it into the river, until there be not one small stone found there. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. And we'll pause right there for a little bit. And so we've seen, we saw this particularly in the last chapter, that Ahithophel, when Ahithophel would counsel someone, that the nation of Israel saw this as if it was God himself giving counsel, because his counsel was so good. And by good, I mean it worked. People might not agree with the tactics. People might not agree with the abrasiveness of times. But nobody would doubt that if Ahithophel told you to do something and you did it, it would produce the intended result. We saw that happen in the last chapter. And so when Absalom is getting ready to go to battle with his father, which was an inevitability, right? When you have a coup rise up, you can't just leave David and his men alone. You can't just leave a man as dangerous as David and as dangerous as his mighty men, and we'll see his mighty men later in the chapter. But you can't just leave them out there just wandering around doing whatever they want to do and feel as if your coup has been successful. And so the battle was inevitable. It was going to happen. And so here Absalom is coming to Ahithophel, as he would, and asking for counsel. Now we know that God had, through David, had put channels in place to turn Absalom's mind against the counsel of Ahithophel. And that's exactly what we see taking place in this chapter. And so David's plan, which was ultimately God's plan, but David's plan is working. And so Ahithophel is not done giving counsel, and Absalom had proved himself ready and willing to listen. We saw that in chapter 16. And so Ahithophel here counsels Absalom to let him take a large contingent, not all the soldiers, but a large contingent of men, and he would go that very night. He would pursue David. He would find David while David was at his weakest. Right? They've been traveling. They're on the run. They don't have all the supplies they need. He would find David when David was at his weakest, and essentially they could quickly and with their numbers just overwhelm David and his men. And he said, My promise to you is that I'm not going to do anything but execute David. I will execute David. That eliminates the threat. Immediately upon his execution, his men will have nothing else to fight for. They'll come and follow you. You are his son after all. And so this will be quick. It'll be painless. And all this will be over with. And now you can just be the king without having all this looming over you. You can just be the king and rule the nation. And so this, again, it would have worked. Ahithophel's counsel would have been effective. If they had left that very night and pursued after David with a number of about 2,000, is what he said, 2,000 soldiers, and if all this had gone to play as Ahithophel said, this would have been the most effective way to deal with the looming threat of David. And so this is very practical. Like I said, Ahithophel's counsel works. It produces exactly what he wants to produce. However, even though the counsel pleased Absalom, it sounded good. This would probably work. For some unthinkable reason, Absalom wants a second opinion. And this is the most remarkable thing. This is our clue already, before we even get to later in the chapter. This is already our clue that God is at work here. Because nobody gets a second opinion after Ahithophel has given you counsel. I mean, again, we saw at the end of chapter 16, verse 23, it says, "And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God." And so if Ahithophel said, "Here's what you need to do," nobody listens to that and says, "You know what, that sounds great. Let's get a second opinion on this." That's just not how things were done. And so he, for some unthinkable reason, and that reason is God, but for some unthinkable reason, Absalom now wants to bring in Hushai, who he had already been, at the very least, suspicious of in the last chapter. And so he brings in Hushai, and remember, Hushai is David's friend. And this is exactly what David intended to happen. He planted Hushai. He said, "You go back." He said, "Don't stay with me. I can't deal with the fact that I might lose you," because David knows this is dangerous. He knows that he's probably going to lose some people. And so I don't want to lose you. You go back and you ingratiate yourself with Absalom. And he tells us specifically, so that you can defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And this is exactly what happens here. And so he brings in Hushai. And again, this is just because God is working. And he wants the counsel of Hushai to kind of compare. And so he brings in Hushai and tells him, "Here's what Ahithophel said we should do. What do you think about this?" And it's interesting, too, that he said that he tells him the plan of Ahithophel. He didn't have to tell him, but he does. And so Hushai was able to say, and again, trying to stay on his good side, it's good. It's just maybe not right for right now. It's just not the best counsel for now. He says, not good at this time. And so here's what he tells Absalom. Listen, you know David. You know David better than anybody. You know how strong he is. You know how good he is at fighting. You know the kind of men that he has surrounded himself with. Furthermore, you also know that David's not just going to hole up in a fortress somewhere. No, he's going to go find a pit. He's going to go find a cave. He's going to go find the most inconvenient place for you to come sweep through and take him out. He's not going to let himself be available like that. And so he and his men are like a bear who has lost her cubs. They're mad, they're angry, they're ready to strike out. They have the experience. Again, this is the guy who everybody's saying his praises. He's killed his 10,000s, right? This is a guy who knows how to fight. He's surrounded with men who know how to fight. They're going to find the most fortifiable position. This is not going to be an easy thing. And so he said, what's going to happen is you're going to go try, and with your 2,000 guys, you're going to go try and sweep them out. And he says, and all of a sudden, some of your men are going to start to die, because that's just how good David and his men are. And as soon as some of your men start to die, word's going to get around, and everybody's going to know, uh-oh, David's back at it. David is winning. David is getting victorious. And he says, as soon as that starts going to happen, and the word gets around, the hearts of your people are going to melt. They're going to know Absalom can't win this. They're going to turn back to David. And so instead, what he says, what you need to do is you need to get all Israel. You need to get all the soldiers you can. And you don't need to send Ahithophel. You yourself need to stand in front of this massive army, and you need to come down and make it so that David has no chance of winning. Even if he were to make a valiant stand, there was no chance with the numbers that you're going to have. And so essentially, and then he says, even if he's not in a pit, even if he's gone into a city, we'll tear the city down to the ground. We'll throw the city into the ocean. And so, there's no chance that David has a survival. And so what he's doing here is a couple of things. Number one, he's appealing to Absalom's pride. What would look better for the new king of the new Israel? To have sent somebody to quick and painlessly in the night take care of the problem? Or for you to be the one standing in front of your army coming against David and defeating the renowned David, even if it is your own father, right? What looks better as far as an optics thing? And remember, Absalom is nothing if not the politician, right? And so he understands optics. That's how he successfully led this coup in the first place. And so he's appealing to Absalom's pride here, but also, and the biggest thing that he's doing is if Absalom goes with Ahithophel's plan, Hushai has no time to get word to David of what's going to happen. Ahithophel is saying, I'm leaving tonight. We're going to go deal with this now. And so Hushai needs some time to be able to get word to David about what's going on. And so it's going to take time for Absalom to gather together this massive army. And so this is essentially what he's doing. Just it's buying him time to get word to David to allow David to respond appropriately. And so Ahithophel's counsel is to strike quick and get out fast. Hushai appeals to Absalom's pride to take the time that is necessary to gather the largest army he can, and so giving David time to respond. Now, Absalom falls for this. He absolutely loves it, and it makes sense that he would. Again, he cares about the optics. He was a prideful man, and so he falls for this, and he says, for the Lord had appointed, is what we read in verse 14, for the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. And so from this, we understand, as I said earlier, Ahithophel's counsel would have worked. In this situation, it was the best thing that they could do. But God wanted Absalom to fail. And so he changes his mind a little bit, if for no other reason. He sends a little seed of doubt into Absalom's mind that maybe Ahithophel's counsel, maybe I do need a second opinion on this, which he never probably would have asked for before this. And so thus we see both, and this is the interesting thing about this chapter, and not just this chapter, but all over the Bible. We see both the free will of man and God's sovereignty at play. With Absalom's free will, he chose to get a second opinion, and then he chose to take Hushai's counsel. And yet, God sovereignly was over the whole thing to make sure that Absalom took Hushai's counsel. And so what do we do with that? Do we say, well, that man ultimately has free will, or that God ultimately is sovereign? Well, we understand both, and the Scriptures teach both. And this is a concept that is not only taught throughout all the Scriptures, but has been debated since the Scriptures were written. This constant back and forth between free will and God's sovereignty. And I liked how Del Ralph Davis said this. He said, Yahweh's sovereignty is not meant to give you philosophical problems, but spiritual comfort. And so at the end of the day, it's impossible for us to answer the question, how can both things be true? It's impossible for us to answer that. At the end of the day, we stand on the fact that we serve a sovereign God who has allowed us free will to do things, particularly sin, but he has allowed us a certain degree of free will. How do those things both exist? How can you say there's free will in a world where you serve a sovereign God? I can't answer that. All I can say is that his ways are higher than mine. His thoughts are higher than mine. I can't figure these things out, at least not here. Maybe I will one day. But it should stand for, or it should be a foundational means of comfort to the Christian to know that we do serve a sovereign God, that there's not purposelessness to the things that are happening, that there is a reason behind it all. And so that the fact that God is behind the scenes working together all things to complete his good will, there should be a comfort to Christians. And so this is what we stand upon. No, I can't put all the particulars together and have a perfect understanding of it all. And nobody's ever been able to do. That's why the whole topic has been debated literally for thousands of years. People have debated this topic. And we're not going to come to a firm conclusion on this. And there's vastly different opinions on all this. You have some people who are far on the sovereignty side that say there is no free will whatsoever, that God predetermines every single action, even your sin, that God is basically, they make God the author of sin. And then you have people on the far other side who are they kind of refer to themselves as open deists, who say that God doesn't actually really know what's going to happen. He's just kind of reacting in time to the things that are going on earth. Well, I say, well, both of those are wrong. I would say both of those are heretical. So there's a healthy medium there somewhere. Where exactly is that line? I don't know. I can't say because I'm not God. But again, at the end of the day, we can spend all day debating and talking about all the ins and outs and all this, but at the end of the day, what should we do? Be thankful that we have a God who is sovereign. That's what we should do. And so that's where we'll leave that. And so as we continue the story, verse 15, let's begin reading again. It says, Then said Hushai unto Zadok and to Abiathar the priest, Thus and thus did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders, and thus have I counseled. And so it's interesting, I'll quickly interject here. Hushai didn't actually know which one had won out. He had left before Absalom made the decision. And so he says, here's what's going on. Get word to David as fast as possible because I don't know which one Absalom's going to take. Verse 16, Now therefore send quickly and tell David, saying, Lodge not this night in the plains of the wilderness, but speedily pass over, lest the king be swallowed up, and all the people that are with him. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stayed in Enrogel, for they might not be seen to come into the city. And a wench went out and told them, and they went and told King David. Nevertheless, a lad saw them and told Absalom, but they went both of them away quickly and came to a man's house in Bahurim, which had a well in his court, whither they went down. And a woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and spread ground corn thereon, and the thing was not known. And when Absalom's servants came to the woman to the house, they said, Where is Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, They be gone over the brook of water. And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. And it came to pass after they departed that they came up out of the well and went and told King David and said unto David, Arise and pass quickly over the water, for thus hath Ahithophel counseled against you. And then David arose and all the people that were with him, and they passed over Jordan by the morning light. There were lacked not one of them that had not gone over Jordan. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, put his household in order, and hanged himself and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. And then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom passed over Jordan, he and all those men of Israel with him. And Absalom made Amasa captain of the host instead of Joab, which Amasa was a man's son, whose name was Ithra, an Israelite, that went into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister to Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And so Israel and Absalom pitched in the land of Gilead. And we'll stop right there. We'll see the last few verses here in a moment. And so Hushai then does exactly as he was supposed to do. Now, again, this goes back a couple of chapters where David had set all this up. And so essentially he says, Hushai, you go in, you get in with Absalom, you defeat the counsel of Ahithophel if you can, but you send back information. And the way you're going to send back information is through the sons of Zadok and Abiathar. And so Hushai would tell them, the priests, who are still there in Jerusalem, they would tell their sons, and the sons would go relay the information to David. And so they do this, and they tell David to speedily pass over, lest the king be swallowed up, and all the people that are with him. And so again, remember, Hushai does not know which counsel Absalom has chosen to follow. So all he knows is David needs to get out now. Either way, it works best. Either if he takes Ahithophel's counsel, he's got to get out now because he has no other time. If he takes mine, that's just more time for him to get away, to make a plan, to get fortified, to do all that they need to do. And so either way, this is the best that he can do. Now, the text tells us, and we get this interesting story, that a maid or a wench, this woman, that she comes out, and she brings the news to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who are Zadok and Abiathar's sons. But as they're leaving to go tell David, a boy sees them. We don't know anything about this boy. We don't know how he knows that this conversation is somehow related to information getting back to David. We don't know any of these details. But somehow or another, he sees this conversation happen. Maybe he overhears it. We just don't know. We're not told. But somehow he knows what has been said, and he knows that they're trying to get information to David. And so he informs Absalom. Whether that was a direct conversation or whether he just told somebody who told, again, we don't know. We're not given many of the details here. And so as Absalom's men then come out and they pursue Jonathan and Ahimaaz, they make their way to a David sympathizer. We're not given the name of the man or his wife or their family, but he's a David sympathizer. And the only way we know that is because they willingly hide these men from Absalom. And so they have a well there on their property. And so the two men, they go down into the well. His wife comes out, spreads a sheet over the covering of that well and puts some corn on it. Basically makes it look like this is some kind of a mill where they can grind up grain. They don't understand that it's a well. So they don't think to look in it, essentially. And so this works beautifully, and they have no idea what's happened. And the woman comes out and she says, oh, they left. They went over the water. And so, they pursue, and they pursue them in the wrong direction. Again, we kind of talked about this last week. We've seen stories like this before, very, very similar to, for instance, Rahab. where she lies about where the spies were, and we've seen stories that I won't go over all that. We had that discussion last week. But the men flee in the wrong direction, and essentially what happens is Jonathan and Ahimaaz were now safe to get to David, to give David the information he needed. And so, like all of these stories that we see in the Old Testament, the author here is not commenting on the morality of what this woman did. He's not saying this was a good thing that she lied. He's not saying it's a bad thing that she lied. All he's saying is that she lied and the men got to David safely. That he's just telling the story as it happened. He's not commenting on any of the morality of the situation. But what happens is the men are able to get to David safely. They are able to purport the information as it needed to be given. And so, again, we see the strange workings of God's providence. God was able to use that woman to protect those men. That does not mean that she was innocent of lying. That's not what that means. But that means that God's providence is able to work through good actions, bad actions, amoral actions. It doesn't matter. God can work through the means of men to mankind, that is, to bring about his will. And that's exactly what this story shows us. And so David then gets the needed information, and he and all his people safely cross the Jordan. And that really sets us up for the next chapter where the battle actually takes place. Now, we get this verse that almost is shocking, and it kind of just seems like it's out of left field here. But verse 23, Ahithophel finds out, whether he was told directly or just kind of figured out based upon the movings of the king, whatever happened, he finds out that his advice was not followed. And all of a sudden, we see him very methodically and very thought out, and this is in keeping with kind of with his nature. This seems to fit with how he would give counsel. It was very thought out, very methodical. Again, it would work. And so he comes home, it says, puts his household in order, and then he hangs himself and he dies. And so he commits suicide here, and it's like, again, this is almost just thrust in here, almost shockingly so. And so the only motive that we're given is he saw that his counsel was not followed. Now, there's likely one or two reasons, or one or two implications for that, as far as why would that lead to him hanging himself. Number one, he was devastated that Absalom had listened to Hushai instead of him, and that led to crushing disappointment, a deep onslaught of depression that just instantly led from being a relatively high-ranking individual in the new regime of Absalom's kingdom to all of a sudden seeing himself as useless and not needed. All of his counsel before has been followed. Now, for the first time, it's been questioned. And so it just leads to this crushing disappointment, and he goes and he kills himself. I'll tell you, that seems very unlikely to me. What seems much, much more likely is that he knows that because the king did not take his advice, that he's not going to be successful. Again, Ahithophel knows his counsel works. Ahithophel understands. There was a reason why Ahithophel counseled Absalom to act in this way. Let me go and take care of this quickly and right now. Don't give David time to react. Because Ahithophel knows, again, Ahithophel was David's counselor before he was Absalom. He knows David. And so he knows if you give David an inch, he's going to take a mile. He doesn't need much. He's very resourceful. He's successful in what he does. He's a man of war. He's surrounded by men of war. If you give him a little bit, he's going to take a lot, and he will win. David will get this kingdom back if you don't do it this way. I believe that's more in line with what Ahithophel thought. And so his thinking is, Absalom has now lost. Because he didn't take my counsel, Absalom is now lost. Whether or not in actuality, it's just a matter of time. And so that means David is going to get the throne back. And what's going to happen to old Ahithophel once David gets the throne back? The one who betrayed him. The one who flipped sides and went with his son. And so I think Ahithophel is basically, again, he's a very practical man. Essentially, here's what he's doing. He's getting ahead of the matter. Here's what he says. I'm going to die one way or another. Whether I die now by my own hand or whether I die whenever David gets the throne back, it is inevitable. It's going to happen. And so what does he do? He comes home. He gets his household in order. We don't know all that entails, but he gets his household in order, and he hangs himself. And so this, to me, seems the much more likely reason. And what's interesting about this verse is that he is a foreshadowing, I guess you could say, of the one who would later betray the greatest son of David. And so Ahithophel betrays David, and what does he do? He hangs himself. Later on down the line, the greater son of David will also be betrayed, and the one who betrayed him will also hang himself. And so again, we have very much a foreshadowing from the life of David and the events of David to what would happen with his greatest son, Jesus. And there's also a possible foreshadowing, although I think this is much, much weaker. But there's a possible foreshadowing here for the manner in which Absalom himself would die. We'll see that in the next chapter, but it's it's kind of a hanging of sorts. We'll see that in the next chapter. But our chapter here ends with a look towards the coming battle, right? So we're getting, preparations are being made for the battle that's upcoming, and that's how the chapter ends. And so first of all, we see Absalom moving his army. And so by the fact that Absalom is doing this, now he has a captain, but Absalom is very much in charge of this, is in line with Hushai's advice. But he's leading his army, he's moving his army, led by this man Amasa. And Amasa was David's nephew and Joab's cousin. And there will be more about Amasa later on. Joab and Amasa will have some interesting times together. We'll just leave it at that, and we'll see that in the upcoming chapter. And so on the other hand, we see David and his men also being preparing, but not in the same manner. And so verse 27, it says, "And it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim, that Shobi, the son of Nahash of Reba, the children of Ammon, and Makir, the son of Amiel of Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds and basins and earthen vessels, and wheat and barley and flour and parched corns and beans, lentils and parched pulse, honey and butter and sheep and cheese of kine for David and for the people that were with him to eat. For they said, the people is hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness." And so this is now the second time we've seen David being brought provisions by an outside source. Essentially, he's not having to go out and get these things. They're being brought to him without him having even asked for them. And both times they've been by, I guess you could say, unlikely sources. The first time, as we saw, I think his last chapter, it was by Mephibosheth's caretaker, who makes up a story about Mephibosheth, but seemingly trying to get closer to David. But in doing so, he brings a good number of provisions. Well, here again, there are a good number of provisions brought to David by an unlikely assortment of people. The first one is this man Shobi. Now, we can't say definitively, but it certainly seems as though by the genealogy, I guess you could say, given, it says that Shobi was the son of Nahash of Reba of the children of Ammon. So being the son of Nahash means, and of the children of Ammon, tells us that Shobi here is very much likely the brother of Hanan. Now, I know it's been several weeks since we looked at this, but Hanan took over as the king of Ammon after Nahash died. And back in chapter 10, we're told that David and Nahash had a good relationship, that David had showed kindness to Nahash. And as Hanan takes over, David plans to do the same with him. And he was going to show kindness. And he sends a group of guys to Hanan to, basically tell him, hey, let's have a good relationship, good political ties. And if you remember the story, Hanan, it seems as if originally was going to accept that, but then he gets counsel from some of his people saying, hey, no, David is not trying to show kindness, he's trying to trick you. And so they shame those men and send them back. And that leads to a war with the Ammonites. And so what seems to be the most likely, again, we cannot say this definitively, but what seems by this verse to have happened is that Hanan was overthrown and probably killed, and that this man, Shobi, was likely put in place as the head king, whatever you want to call him, of Ammon, as kind of a vassal ruler. Essentially, he rules Ammon, but he rules Ammon through the confines of Israel. And so that, again, we can't say that with any degree of certainty, but based upon this description here, that certainly seems to be the case. And then if that is the case, you can see that David had much better relationship with him than he had with his brother. And then you have this other guy, Makir. Makir was the former host of Mephibosheth and Lodabar before David had him moved to Jerusalem. And so Mephibosheth had been staying with Machir on his property before David had him moved to Jerusalem. And then the last man was Barzillai. He's an older, very wealthy man from Rogelim. We're going to actually see more about him in chapter 19. But these men bring a large number of provisions. But here's the thing. They risk a lot in doing so. And the reason I say that is because they understand. Their relationship with David was such that they understood that David was the rightful king. That's why they're doing this. They support David. They do not support Absalom in his overthrow. They support David. They believe that David should be the king. But here's the problem, because at the moment, David was not on the throne. David was on the run. Absalom was on the throne. Absalom, at this point, whether or not he was the rightful king, was the one ruling. And so why does that matter? Because if Absalom had won, given the times, given how these cultures operated, if Absalom had won, David was killed. David is no longer a threat. Absalom has now consolidated his power over the nation of Israel and his kingdom and his throne. One of the most likely things he would have done is to either imprison or put to death those who were closest to David, those who might potentially cause him problems in his new rule. That would have been almost expected. And so essentially these men, by doing this, are placing a lot on the line should David lose. And of course, they don't know what's going to happen. But here they buck against that, because essentially they're saying, whether or not you win or lose, we're showing our solidarity, we're showing our support, and we're going to provide for you and your men. And so we see the chapter in here with war on the forefront, right? And so everything's leading to battle. That's what this is all leading to, which we'll see in chapter 18. However, what we see in chapter 17 is that David's betrayer is dead. Now, not Absalom, but Ahithophel. David's betrayer is dead. His men are now full. And most importantly, God is on his side. Right? And so this is something that we've seen with David throughout his life, even before he was king, is that God has consistently been for and with David. God left Saul, and he put his favor upon David. Even Saul himself said as much. And so he understood this. David has faced a lot of things in his life. Some of it by his own hand, some of it by sins that he had committed. But David has consistently faced resistance and almost uphill battles, almost his entire life, and yet consistently has reigned victorious. And so there's a good lesson here, because we read in the New Testament, that God doesn't call the rich, God doesn't call the wise, God doesn't call the strong. Who does he call? God consistently calls and works through and makes successful those for whom God would get the most glory. In other words, if somebody knew David out in the sheepfold, long before they had ever heard of Saul or Goliath or any of these names, if somebody just knew David out in the sheepfold, watching over the sheep, probably nobody in their right mind would have ever thought, there stands one of the future greatest men that Israel ever produced. He's just a shepherd boy. He's just out there doing what he's supposed to be doing, watching the sheep. And yet consistently, he's faced opposition after opposition, and probably all along the way, people thought, well, now David's finally met his match. Now David is finally going to be undone. And yet consistently, Saul, no, he not that he bettered Saul, is that God lowered Saul. And then he finally gets the kingdom, but now it's kind of split. Well, maybe David's not going to be successful here. He has the smaller kingdom. Israel has the bigger kingdom. And then he's successful in that, and now he's the king over the whole nation. Well, now his son has taken the kingdom away, and he's stolen the hearts of the people of Israel, and he's on the run, and he has a far smaller contingent of people than what Absalom has, and so now he's going to be unsuccessful. Now he's going to be, but no, God consistently puts David on top. Now, what do we take away from that? Is that because David was just so great of a man? No, not necessarily. Now, I'm not trying to take away from David. I think David was a mighty impressive individual. Very wise, very smart, very intelligent. He was great in war and warfare. But why was David so successful time and time again? It's because David had a heart after God's heart. It's because God favored David, and David consistently gave the glory back to God. That's why David was so successful. And so when we look at a guy like David, I think it's good to be in awe, but we need to be in awe of God. When we look at David in his life, David and all the things that he faced, having God on his side is why he was successful. And so as we end chapter 17, the world might think, this is it for David. He can't win over this. But the Christian, even if you don't know the rest of the story, the Christian can come to the end of chapter 17. And we may not know how God puts him back on that throne, but we have full confidence that he will. Not because of anything that David has to say or do, but because we know and understand God and his nature. And so this becomes an interesting chapter because it's all just kind of setting up what's to come over the next couple of chapters. But it's an important foundation. And so chapter 18 makes a whole lot more sense when we have chapter 17. And again, all of it is showing us the hand of God and how he's moving David into the right place at the right time. So important stuff for us to see.